first up in our discussion of Anglophone colonization, or the colonization of England in Canada, is our conversation about economics and some conversations about taxation. And this is not really about numbers, this is really about philosophy. This is about what these things are supposed to do. So one of the things that you need to understand about very early taxation in Canada, so taxation that starts sort of in that 1600s kind of era, is that the very early forms of taxation in Canada are really about, um, I guess the best way to put it is to say regulation. So you apply taxes essentially to prevent people from doing things you don't want them to do. We still have taxes like this. So for example, this is what taxes on cigarettes are. So one of the reasons that you pay cigarette taxes on cigarettes is because the government is trying to discourage you from smoking. Carbon taxes are the same way. They're designed to discourage you from doing a thing that the government doesn't want you to do. And one of the things that's really important to understand is that before 1763, all taxes in Canada were like that. The taxes were designed to sort of control behavior. After 1763, the change is that those taxes become a way for the government to generate revenue, a way for the government to pay for its own activities. And this sort of is accompanied by that shift, right? We sort of talked about it last week a little bit about that shift towards colonies paying their own way, such as it is, because before that, the empire, i.e. the British Crown, was responsible for paying for all of the expenses of the Canadian government, and after 1763, there's this movement towards having colonies pay their own way, okay? So there's that first shift, right, away from regulatory taxes towards revenue generating taxes. And the other thing that you should probably understand about economics in sort of that early period in North America is that Canada's economy is almost entirely resource-based. Okay, so there's an argument that this is still the case, but for right now, we're going to talk about this as a historical thing. And what that means is that almost all of the economic activity in Canada is related in some way to the production or extraction of resources. So good examples of this are selling furs, and we could talk a little bit about the economics of fur, selling timber, so cutting down forests, producing logs and lumber, fisheries, which is, again, arguably still the case in a contemporary context in terms of resource extraction. You might also add oil and gas and stuff like that, but that's not really the case in 1763. And one of the things that sort of comes along with that is that most manufactured goods, so clothing and cloth and that kind of thing, is imported. So it comes from largely the factories in Britain, although lots of it is also coming up from factories in the United States. And that creates a certain economic position for the Canadian economy. Because if your entire economy is based on that kind of resource extraction, you're really, really vulnerable, as anyone who lives and grew up in Alberta knows, you're really, really, really vulnerable to shifts in the sort of global price and demand for those things. Okay, and in this sort of context, one of the things that you need to understand is that the market for things like fur changes dramatically when you have, for example, a change in fashion, right? If for 20 years everyone needs to have a beaver fur coat to be really fashionable, then you're going to sell a lot of beaver. But if the fashion changes, i.e. if you have technology that allows you to make waterproof coats out of something other than beaver and that becomes the trend, then that market crashes really, really quickly. And in a market and in an environment where you have lots of different economic activities in a community or in a country, that's not a huge problem. But in an environment where that kind of resource extraction is the central aspect of economic growth, you do have a problem when that changes, and that's sort of one of that vulnerability pieces. So the rest of this video we're going to talk also about economics, but we're going to talk about economics in sort of Britain, because those are also really, really important, and we're going to talk a little bit about how trade policy works in Britain. The first thing we got to talk about is something that is referred to in Britain as the Corn Laws. Okay, and these are laws, as far as Britain is concerned, which were intended to encourage British factories and British manufacturers to purchase goods produced in Britain. So the idea was that you should probably, if you run a manufacturing company in Britain and you're using corn, you should be buying corn that was purchased in Britain, or that was produced in Britain, that was grown in Britain. as I said, corn laws. And that was the initial start in sort of 1815, and these laws last till 1846 or so, 1845, 1846. The relevant thing, though, to understand in terms of Canada's economy is that in 1820, the British Crown expanded their definition of what counted as local. Okay? And in particular, they expanded their definition of local or British goods to include goods produced in British colonies, which means goods produced in Canada. And that sort of meant that if you were producing, say, bread or biscuits or something like that in Britain, and you bought your flour from France, for example, you would be paying a really high tariff. You'd be paying a relatively significant tax because you had imported your flour from somewhere else. If you bought that same amount of flour from Canada, you didn't have to pay that tax because the government of the British Crown was trying to encourage economic production in their colonies. That's really, really, really important to understand because it's actually one of the reasons why there's so much emphasis on the production of grain, the growing of wheat in North America, especially in Canada, because you had essentially this guaranteed market for it, right? Because you have these massive factories that are growing really, 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 really quickly in Britain. And Britain is a very small island, so Britain can't produce enough grain, enough agricultural products to feed all of its people and all of its factories at the same time. They can't do it. But Canada is really, really big. So Canada can produce the grain that feeds those British factories, and because they know the Brits are going to buy it, they can produce, they feel relatively confident in producing that grain because they know someone's going to pay for it, and that encourages a lot of people, and the government policy that accompanies this, to encourage the production of farming sort of across Canada, especially as we sort of go west. And most of that is, again, grain that's intended for production and consumption in the export market, so in the markets of sort of Britain and stuff like that. It's not really a conversation about how do we produce the food that the people who live around us need to eat, because if you're producing exclusively for the people who live really close to you, you wouldn't grow entirely wheat because people are going to want wheat and apples and all of these other things. You're going to get a much more diversified crop system. But if you're producing for export, you tend to produce a smaller number of crops in larger quantities. That's really important to understand. These policies have a really long-lasting effect, but they don't last very long. In about 1840 or so, the British Crown starts talking about moving away from that kind of regulatory taxation. They're moving away from a policy of we're going to tax you if you're buying grain from anywhere other than sort of our colonies. And they can kind of do that because Britain is the most advanced industrial economy in the world at that point in time. Okay, so one of the reasons that you would put in tariffs like that, one of the reasons that you would charge people a tax if they bought things from outside of your market, is to encourage those markets locally. So, for example, if you want to encourage the manufacturing of cars in your community and in your country, you charge a tax if people buy cars that are built elsewhere, right? Because that means that you, again, guaranteed a market for cars that are produced here because they're going to be cheaper than cars that are produced elsewhere. And you need to do that if you're trying to protect a growing sector of your economy. You need to protect something that is maybe at risk. You don't need to do that in the same way if you know for certain that there is going to be a market for your manufactured goods, regardless of whether or not there's a tariff on them. Okay. And that is generally the case if either you happen to be the only one producing a particular kind of good, doesn't happen very often, or you know that your goods are going to be the best or the cheapest for other reasons. And at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that means one of two things. Either you have sort of dealt with the scaling question. So you're producing cheaper manufactured goods because you're producing 1,000 of them a day, and you found all of the efficiencies that make that production cheaper. So someone who's producing, say, only 10 of them a day has to charge more because they can't, for example, have one person whose job is only this one fiddly little thing, and they get really good at it, and so it's faster. The other thing, too, is that if you're dealing with sort of complex technological pieces, So in sort of a contemporary 1840s example, when we're talking about something like the production of stoves, um, if you produce the iron that goes into stoves wrong, you can have flaws in it that make, stoves explode, they melt, they burn down your house, all kinds of bad things happen if you don't get the metallurgy right, if you don't get the production of iron right. That's an industrial process. And if you are dealing with a company that's making stoves and can't guarantee the quality of its iron, someone's going to pay more for the higher technology piece produced largely in Britain because they have the factories that have been doing this for a while now, this sort of higher quality iron and these higher quality products. That means that you have sort of that guaranteed market. So when Britain moves towards free trade in the 1840s, what they're aiming to do is to ensure that their manufacturing sector, their factories, their capitalists, their companies, don't have to worry about taxes so they can get their raw materials as cheaply as possible anywhere in the world. And that's okay as far as the British Crown is concerned because they're not worried about being able to sell their goods because they know their goods are better than the goods that are being produced pretty much anywhere else. So they know British companies can compete. This is a conversation that we're still having in a lot of ways about free trade, and that basically a lot of the arguments are saying that free trade benefits the most advanced economies the most. So the wealthier you are, the higher your technology level, the better educated your population is, the more free trade benefits you because you can buy your stuff for cheaper, but you don't have to worry about losing your market because there are no tariffs. That's sort of an important thing to consider more generally, but that is our discussion sort of at an overview, I guess, of those ideas about British trade policy and sort of how economies were working and shifting in that early colonial period.